Grace Hammond sat in her weathered rocking chair, watching the February snow pile against her cabin windows. At 67, her steel-gray eyes still held the sharp focus that had served her through 3 tours as a battlefield medic in Afghanistan and Iraq. The mountains of Colorado had become her refuge after retirement, a place where her skills seemed as obsolete as the faded medical kit that sat by her front door. The emergency radio crackled to life, breaking the mountain silence. A rescue helicopter carrying 6 civilians had crashed on Ridge Peak during the blizzard. Grace knew that terrain like the back of her scarred hands. She'd trained survival techniques there decades ago when the military still valued experience over youth. Every dangerous slope, every hidden crevice, every treacherous ice formation was burned into her memory. She pulled on her worn hiking boots and drove her old pickup truck to the modern rescue facility. The building hummed with high-tech equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. GPS tracking systems, satellite communication devices, advanced life support units that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Young faces bustled around computer screens, their confidence radiating from every movement. "I'd like to offer my medical support," Grace said quietly to the team leader. Captain Stevens, a man in his 30s with perfectly pressed uniforms and a clipboard that never left his hands. Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old paramedic with certification badges covering his jacket, actually laughed out loud. "Thanks, ma'am, but this terrain isn't for someone who's, retired. We need people who can handle extreme conditions." His smirk told her everything about what he thought of her capabilities. Captain Stevens waved her off with practiced politeness. "We appreciate the offer, Mrs. Hammond, but we'll call in the top trauma doctors from Denver General. They have helicopter experience and the latest equipment." Grace nodded calmly, but something flickered behind her eyes, a look that had once made enemy combatants think twice about underestimating the quiet woman with the medical bag. "I understand your concerns, Captain, but if you're short-staffed, we've got everything under control," Stevens interrupted, already turning back to his tactical displays. "This is a professional operation." The unspoken message hung in the air like mountain fog. What could an old woman with a canvas bag possibly contribute to their sophisticated operation? But fate had other plans. 3 team members called in sick with flu just as the helicopter was warming up. Against their better judgment, they allowed Grace to tag along as an observer only. No participation in actual rescue operations. She packed her warm medical bag anyway. The same canvas satchel that had traveled through 3 war zones and saved more lives than anyone in that room had ever seen. As the rescue helicopter lifted off, Grace squeezed into the back corner completely, ignored by the confident young team discussing their sophisticated protocols in technical jargon. They had studied every modern technique, earned certifications from prestigious programs, learned from the newest textbooks written by experts who'd never held a dying person in their arms. None of them had ever pressed their hands against a soldier's chest while mortar exploded 30 feet away. None of them had performed emergency surgery in a canvas tent while sandstorms turned day into night. None of them understood what Grace carried in her quiet, weathered hands. The knowledge that comes only from staring death in the face and refusing to blink. The helicopter banked toward the treacherous mountain peaks, and Grace stared out at the terrain below. In her medical bag, tools most people hadn't seen in decades waited patiently. Simple, reliable, battle-tested instruments that had saved lives when everything else failed. She knew something they didn't understand yet. When lives hang in, the balance, experience beats technology every single time. 3 hours of climbing through ice and snow brought them to the crash site. The helicopter lay twisted against the rocks like a broken bird, its rotors shattered, fuel leaking into the pristine snow. The scene was chaos, scattered equipment, panicked voices, the metallic smell of blood mixing with aviation fuel. Cooper Williams, a 24-year-old soldier on leave, lay trapped under twisted metal with severe abdominal wounds. Blood soaked through his winter jacket, pooling in the snow beneath him. His breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps, his lips turning blue from hypothermia and shock. His pulse was weak and getting weaker. Dr. Mason Cole, the team's lead physician, suffered from severe altitude sickness. His hands shook uncontrollably from oxygen deprivation, his vision blurred, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. The confident doctor who'd briefed them at base camp could barely stand upright. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "I need to check his blood pressure and establish an 4-line immediately. His blood pressure is dropping fast." Jake blocked her path with his arm. "Whoa there, Grandma. This is a medical emergency, not a wilderness tour. Step back and let the professionals work." Rebecca Torres, another nurse fresh from nursing school, pushed past Grace dismissively. "We've learned everything you ever knew, plus 20 years of advances. Evidence-based medicine, the latest trauma protocols. You need to step back." They were so confident in their modern training, so sure. Their fresh certifications trumped her decades of battlefield experience. Their expensive equipment gleamed in the harsh mountain sunlight. Digital monitors, computerized 4 pumps, state-of-the-art diagnostic tools. For 15 agonizing minutes, Grace watched them struggle while Cooper's life drained away. They applied pressure in the wrong places, causing more bleeding. They couldn't find his vein for the 4, sticking him repeatedly with needles that missed their mark. Their hands shook from cold, altitude, and inexperience. Under real pressure, Jake's confident demeanor crumbled as Cooper's pulse disappeared. Under his trembling fingers, Dr. Cole collapsed to his knees, overcome by altitude and panic. Rebecca stared at her blood-covered gloves, hyperventilating. Grace sat quietly on a nearby rock, watching a young man die while trained professionals fumbled with their expensive equipment. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene. Every fiber of her being demanded action, but they'd made it crystal clear she wasn't wanted, wasn't needed, wasn't qualified for their modern methods. When Cooper began convulsing violently, blood pouring from his wounds in rhythmic spurts, the team's composure shattered completely. Their textbook knowledge evaporated under the weight of real trauma, real blood, real death approaching. "We're losing him," Rebecca screamed. "He's coding. What do we do?" Grace couldn't wait anymore. Every second of delay meant Cooper slipping further away from the land of the living. She stood up slowly, stepped over their scattered supplies with determined purpose. "Give me one chance to save him," she said quietly, "or we bury this boy in the snow." Silence fell over the chaos. Even in their desperation, even with Cooper dying before their eyes, they hesitated to trust the old woman they'd dismissed. "He's already gone," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "There's nothing anyone can do now." Grace knelt beside Cooper, her weathered hands moving with surprising speed and precision. "No, child. He's not gone yet." She opened her personal medical kit for the first time. The real work was about to begin. Grace opened her medical kit fully, revealing contents that made the younger medics step back in surprise. Inside were instruments that told 40 years of stories. A scalpel with a handle worn smooth by countless surgeries, 4 tubing that had saved lives in Baghdad and Kandahar, surgical scissors that had cut through everything from military uniforms to aircraft seatbelts to free-trapped soldiers from burning vehicles. Each tool was old but immaculately maintained, wrapped in sterile cloth, arranged with military precision. She put on her reading glasses with steady hands and expertly threaded the 4-line into Cooper's left arm vein. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who'd performed this procedure in sandstorms, Under enemy fire, in the darkness of bombed-out buildings, where flashlights gave away positions to snipers. No fumbling, no hesitation, no wasted motion. After exactly 90 seconds, Cooper's pulse returned, strong and regular, beating against her fingertips like a promise that he would live. Rebecca stood completely speechless, watching techniques she'd never seen in any medical textbook. A soldier from the rescue team whispered in awe, "I've seen movements like that in forward operating bases, but nobody taught procedures that precise." In civilian training, Grace immediately began issuing rapid, clear instructions, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded medical teams under the worst possible conditions. "Rebecca, tie the pressure bandage around his waist, not his chest. Jake, press with your entire palm, not your fingertips. Maintain steady pressure at exactly 45 degrees to his body, or you'll cut off circulation to his legs." She divided them into specialized teams with military efficiency, Rebecca monitoring oxygen levels and respiratory function. Jake, maintaining pressure on the wound. Dr. Cole, handling communication with the base camp medical team, despite his altitude sickness. For the first time since arriving at the crash site, the rescue team stopped trying to lead and started listening to someone who actually knew what she was doing. When they secured Cooper to the stretcher, Rebecca asked quietly, curiosity overcoming her earlier arrogance, "Where exactly did you serve? What unit taught you these techniques?" Grace pulled up her sleeve slowly, revealing a faded but unmistakable tattoo. "Delta Medical, Kandahar 2004, surrounded by a small cross and the words, 'So others may live.'" The entire rescue team fell silent, staring at the marking that identified her as a member of one of the most elite medical units in military history. They weren't just looking at a retired nurse anymore. They were looking at a veteran of some of the most dangerous, classified medical missions ever conducted. Delta medical teams were called in when regular combat medics couldn't handle the situation, when soldiers were trapped in positions too dangerous for normal rescue operations. One by one, they stepped back and let her take complete command of the operation. But Jake's pride still burned. As they prepared for descent, he muttered to Rebecca, "Lucky break, that's all. Anyone could have gotten that 4 if they'd tried her angle." Grace heard him, but said nothing. The mountain would teach its own lesson soon enough. Dr. Cole, recovering slightly from his altitude sickness, pulled Jake aside. "That tattoo. Delta medical units only accepted volunteers for the most dangerous assignments. They had a 97% save rate in conditions where regular medics had 40%. Jake's face paled, but his stubborn streak remained. That was 40 years ago. Medicine has advanced. Grace coordinated their descent with military precision that impressed even the soldiers on the team. She assigned specific positions, established communication protocols, set the pace that would get Cooper down the mountain alive while avoiding the avalanche zone she'd memorized decades earlier. But the mountain had one final, deadly test waiting. For them, halfway down the treacherous slope, an avalanche struck without warning. The safety rope holding Cooper's stretcher snapped under the crushing weight of thousands of tons of snow and ice thundering down the mountainside. The stretcher, with Cooper strapped helplessly inside, began sliding rapidly toward a 100-foot cliff that dropped into a rocky canyon below. Grace didn't hesitate for even a split second. She launched herself down the slope, using her own climbing belt as an emergency anchor line. 40 years of muscle memory and training kicked in as she executed a high-angle rescue maneuver she'd learned during Special Forces medical training. A technique so dangerous it was only taught to elite units. She caught the stretcher exactly 10 feet from the cliff edge, her body absorbing the full impact. Her shoulder wrenched violently as she held Cooper's full weight with one arm while digging her boots into the ice with everything she had. Fighting. gravity and momentum with pure determination. The rest of the team, still scrambling down the safer route, watched in amazement as this 67-year-old woman single-handedly prevented Cooper from plunging to certain death. Jake reached her. First, his face white with shock. "How did you—" "That maneuver ... where did you learn?" "Afghanistan," Grace grunted, still holding the stretcher steady. 2004. Taliban had shot down a medevac helicopter. Same situation, different mountain. As they worked together to secure new ropes, Jake's arrogance finally cracked completely. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen." "Apologies later," Grace replied calmly. "Right now, help me save this boy's life." Rebecca worked frantically to re-establish Cooper's the fourth line that had been disrupted in the slide. Her hands shook not from cold now, but from the realization of how close they'd all come to disaster. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Before we left base camp, Captain Stevens said if this mission failed, it would be because we let an unqualified civilian interfere. Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Did he now? Dr. Cole, monitoring Cooper's vital signs, looked up with newfound respect. "His pulse is stronger than it was at the crash site. Whatever you did up there, it worked. You stabilized him completely." They reached the base medical station as news crews were arriving. Captain Stevens stood before the cameras, already spinning the story. "Our highly trained team executed a flawless rescue operation using the latest medical protocols and equipment." Grace walked past him carrying her blood-stained medical kit. Cooper's life saved by techniques Stevens had dismissed as obsolete. She said nothing, but Rebecca Torres, who had witnessed everything, was already pulling out her phone. "This isn't over," Rebecca whispered to Grace. "People need to know what really happened up there." Within hours, Rebecca's video would be shared thousands of times. The headline appearing on news sites nationwide would read, "67-year-old retired. Nurse saves rescue team that initially rejected her help." But that was just the beginning. Someone else had been watching the news coverage very carefully. Someone who recognized the significance of that faded Delta medical tattoo and knew exactly what Grace Hammond had accomplished in her military career. The phone call that would change everything was already being placed. The video went viral within hours. Rebecca's shaky phone footage showed Grace kneeling beside Cooper in the snow, her weathered hands working with surgical precision while the trained professionals stood helplessly nearby. The most shared clip was Grace catching the sliding stretcher just feet from the cliff edge, a maneuver that defied belief. Colonel Michael Torres, a former Delta Force commander in Texas, saw the footage and immediately made a phone call to the Pentagon. Within minutes, he had confirmation of what many people suspected. Grace Hammond had participated in 3 highly classified special operations medical missions during her military service, including the rescue of captured soldiers behind enemy lines. She wasn't just any retired nurse. She was a decorated combat medic who'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments when other medical personnel refused to go. Meanwhile, Captain Stevens found himself in damage control mode. Reporters were asking uncomfortable questions about why an experienced military medic had been relegated to observer status during a critical rescue operation. Mrs. Hammond was absolutely part of our team, Stevens told Channel 7 News, his practiced smile looking strained. "Our protocol has always been to utilize all available resources." But Jake Morrison wasn't having it anymore. Standing beside his hospital bed, where he was being treated for exhaustion and mild frostbite, he looked directly into the camera. "That's not true." We laughed at her. We told her she was too old, too outdated. I personally blocked her from helping when Cooper was dying. Rebecca nodded beside him. She saved a man's life using equipment I'd never seen before and techniques they don't teach in any nursing school. Then she literally threw herself off a cliff to save him again when the rest of us were still trying to figure out what to do. Next, Dr. Cole, recovered from his altitude sickness, added his own testimony. In 20 years of emergency medicine, I've never seen anyone work under pressure like that. She moved like someone who'd done it 1,000 times before, in much worse conditions. Stevens called an emergency meeting with his team. "This media attention needs to stop," he said, his friendly demeanor replaced by cold authority. "Our department's reputation is at stake. I need everyone to remember that Mrs. Hammond was officially part of our operation from the beginning." "But that's not what happened," Rebecca protested. "That's what the official report will say," Stevens replied sharply. "Anyone who contradicts that report will find their employment status under review." The threat hung in the air like mountain fog. These were young professionals just starting their careers, and Stevens had the power to destroy them with a single phone call to other rescue departments. But Grace Hammond had allies they didn't know about. Colonel Torres arrived at Grace's cabin unannounced, wearing his dress uniform and carrying a thick folder of military records. "Mrs. Hammond, I'm Michael Torres. I served with some of your Delta Medical alumni in Fallujah." Grace invited him in for coffee, unsurprised by the visit. She'd been expecting consequences from the media attention. "I've been authorized to offer you a position developing tactical first aid curriculum for the Military Medical Academy," Torres said. "Your techniques up on that mountain ... They're exactly what we need to teach the next generation." Grace poured coffee with steady hands. "I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I'm not sure I'm ready to deal with military bureaucracy again." "There's something else," Torres said, opening his folder. "Captain Stevens contacted our public affairs office yesterday. He wanted us to verify that your military service was exaggerated for media attention." Grace's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "He suggested that your medical training was routine, that you'd never served in combat zones, and that your actions on the mountain were being misrepresented by overeager reporters." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Torres continued. "He specifically requested that we issue a statement saying you were never qualified for high-risk medical operations." Grace set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am." He seemed very concerned about protecting the public from misinformation about military medical training standards. For the first time since the rescue, Grace Hammond smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Colonel, I think it's time Captain Stevens learned exactly what kind of routine medical training I received." Grace pulled out a metal box from beneath her kitchen table, something she hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside were commendation letters, mission photographs, and official documentation that told a very different story than the one Captain Stevens was trying to sell. "Kandahar Province, 2004, she said, handing Colonel Torres a classified mission report. "Helicopter down in Taliban territory. 4 wounded Special Forces operators trapped behind enemy lines. Regular medevac couldn't reach them due to sustained enemy fire." Torres read silently, his expression growing more serious with each page. "I volunteered for the extraction team," Grace continued. "Spent 18 hours under fire, performed 3 emergency surgeries in a bombed-out building while mortar landed outside. Saved all 4 men." She pulled out another document. "Iraq, 2005. Roadside bomb hit a convoy. I performed a field amputation to free a trapped Marine while his vehicle was on fire." The evidence was overwhelming. Grace Hammond hadn't just been a military nurse. She'd been one of the most decorated combat medics of her generation, specifically selected for missions that regular medical personnel couldn't handle. Colonel Torres made another phone call, this time to the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office. Within an hour, they were preparing a very different press release. one that would make Captain Stevens regret his attempt to discredit a war hero. Meanwhile, Stevens was doubling down on his version of events. He called a press conference, standing behind a podium decorated with the Colorado Rescue Service logo. "I want to address some misunderstandings about our recent rescue operation," he began smoothly. "While we appreciate Mrs. Hammond's enthusiasm, the success of this mission was due to our team's professional training and modern equipment." A reporter raised her hand. "But the video shows your team struggling while Mrs. Hammond took charge." "Video can be misleading," Stevens replied. "Mrs. Hammond assisted under our direct supervision. Any suggestion that our professionally trained staff was inadequate is simply incorrect." That's when Jake Morrison walked into the press conference, still wearing his hospital wristband. He'd been watching from his room, and his conscience finally overcame his fear of Stevens' retaliation. "That's a lie," Jake said loudly, walking straight up to the podium. "We failed completely. Cooper Williams was dying, and we couldn't save him. Grace Hammond pushed us aside and did what we couldn't do." Stevens' face flushed red. "Mr. Morrison, you're speaking out of turn and clearly suffering from altitude-related confusion." "I'm speaking the truth," Jake interrupted. "You want to destroy the reputation of a woman who served 3 combat tours and saved more lives than any of us ever will, just to protect your ego." Rebecca Torres appeared at the back of the room, and behind her walked Cooper Williams himself, discharged from the hospital that morning, specifically to attend this press conference. Cooper approached the microphone, still pale but determined. "Captain Stevens, I'm the person who almost died on that mountain. I was there. I felt my pulse stop, felt the life draining out of me while your team panicked. Grace Hammond brought me back from the dead." He turned to address the cameras directly. "This woman didn't just save my life once. She saved it twice. First with medical skills I didn't know existed, then by throwing herself off a cliff to catch my stretcher. If Captain Stevens wants to take credit for that, he's welcome to throw himself off the same cliff and see how it works out." The room erupted in questions, all directed at Stevens, who was rapidly losing control of his carefully crafted narrative. That's when Colonel Torres walked in, wearing his full dress uniform and carrying a briefcase. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel Michael Torres, United States Army Special Operations Command. I'm here to set the record straight about Mrs. Grace Hammond's qualifications." Stevens' face went white. He hadn't expected military involvement. Torres opened his briefcase and pulled out an official Department of Defense document. "Grace Hammond holds the Combat Medical Badge, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Army Commendation Medal with V device. She participated in 17 classified medical evacuation missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, with a 98% patient survival rate under combat conditions." The reporters scribbled frantically as Torres continued. "She was handpicked for Delta medical operations, missions so dangerous that volunteers were required to complete psychological evaluations, confirming they understood the likelihood of not returning home." Stevens tried to interrupt, but Torres wasn't finished. "Captain Stevens contacted our office yesterday, requesting that we discredit Mrs. Hammond's service record. He suggested she was exaggerating her qualifications for media attention." Torres looked directly at Stevens. "I'm here to inform him that attempting to defame a decorated combat veteran constitutes a potential violation of federal law." The confrontation everyone had been waiting for was about to begin. The press conference became a battlefield. Stevens stood behind his podium, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, as the foundation of his lies crumbled beneath him. "Colonel Torres," Stevens said, trying to regain control, "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. I simply wanted to verify." "There's no misunderstanding," Torres cut him off. He pulled out a thick folder and opened it for the cameras. Here's the phone transcript from your call to our public affairs office. You specifically stated, and I quote, Grace Hammond is an elderly woman seeking attention by exaggerating routine medical training. We need the military to confirm she never served in combat zones and lacks qualifications for emergency medical procedures. The reporters erupted with questions. Stephen's face went from white to red as he realized his own words were being used against him. Furthermore, Torres continued, you requested that we issue a statement saying Mrs. Hammond's actions were reckless and potentially harmful, and that she should be prohibited from participating in future rescue operations. Cooper Williams stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd literally been brought back from the dead. Captain Stevens, you're trying to destroy the reputation of the woman who saved my life. Why? Stevens looked around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The safety protocols, the liability issues. We can't have unqualified personnel. Unqualified? Rebecca Torres stood up, no longer afraid of Stevens' threats. Grace Hammond has more medical combat experience than our entire department combined. She saved Cooper using techniques none of us had ever seen because none of us had ever been trained for real trauma. Jake stepped beside Rebecca, solidarity overcoming his fear of career consequences. Captain, you trying to cover? Up the fact that we failed. Our expensive equipment, our modern training, our professional certifications, none of it mattered when someone was actually dying. Dr. Cole, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. I've reviewed Cooper's medical records from the mountain. Grace's field treatment was flawless. Her four-placement pressure point technique and blood loss management followed protocols I didn't even know existed. She didn't just save his life. She did it better than I could have done in a fully equipped emergency room. Stevens made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. Even if Mrs. Hammond has military experience, she's not certified for civilian rescue operations. Our insurance, our liability coverage. Actually, said a new voice from the back of the room, she is certified. Everyone turned to see David Chen, the state certification board director, walking forward with his own briefcase. Mrs. Hammond's military medical certifications automatically qualify her for emergency response operations under Colorado state law. They're equivalent to advanced paramedic certification with combat trauma specialization. Stevens stared at Chun in disbelief. That's not possible. It's been state law since 2018, Chun replied. Military combat medics with Grace's qualifications are considered overqualified for civilian rescue operations, not underqualified. The legal walls were closing in around Stevens from every direction. Colonel Torres delivered the final blow. Captain Stevens, the Department of Defense takes a very serious view of attempts to discredit military service members. We've forwarded your communications to the Inspector General's office for investigation. A reporter shouted a question. Captain Stevens, will you resign? Stevens looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Cooper, whom he tried to use as a prop for his false narrative. Rebecca and Jake, whose careers he'd threatened. Grace Hammond herself, sitting quietly in the back row, watching his destruction with the same calm expression she'd worn while saving a man's life. This press conference is over, Stevens said, abandoning the podium and pushing through the crowd toward the exit. But Grace Hammond stood up, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Captain Stevens. He stopped, forced to turn around and face her. Next time you want to question someone's qualifications, she said quietly, make sure you know who you're dealing with first. The room was completely silent as Stevens walked out, his career in ruins, his reputation destroyed by his own arrogance and lies. But Grace Hammond's story was just beginning. 3 months later, Grace Hammond stood before a lecture hall filled with young military medics at the U.S. Army Medical Training Center. On the projection screen behind her was a photograph from Ridge Peak, the twisted helicopter wreckage, where Cooper Williams had nearly died, and where an old woman had proven that experience trumps arrogance every time. Today we're going to talk about something they don't teach in textbooks. Grace began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. What happens when everything you've learned fails, and you have to rely on what you know? The students listened with rapt attention as she demonstrated the pressure point technique that had restored Cooper's pulse. The four-threading method that worked in sandstorms and blizzards. The field surgery procedures that had saved lives when regular protocols weren't enough. Captain Stevens had been quietly transferred to a desk job in Denver, his rescue certification revoked pending a full investigation. The Colorado Rescue Service had implemented new policies, requiring respect for military medical veterans, and had invited Grace to serve as their senior medical advisor. Rebecca Torres had been promoted to team leader, with Jake Morrison as her deputy. Dr. Cole had enrolled in additional trauma training, specifically requesting to study battlefield medical techniques. Cooper Williams had recovered completely and started a foundation supporting military veteran healthcare initiatives. But the most important change was the wooden sign that now stood at the Ridge Peak Trailhead, Hammond Pass, where lives are saved by courage and experience. Hikers, climbers, and rescue teams from across the country made pilgrimages to understand what had really happened on that mountain. During her lunch break, Grace walked outside the training facility and called Cooper, who was back home in Texas, but called her every week. "How are the new students?" Cooper asked. "Young, eager, overconfident," Grace replied with a smile. "Remind me of another rescue team I met recently." "Are you teaching them humility?" "I'm teaching them that equipment fails when you need it most. Communication systems break down in emergencies, and weather doesn't care about carefully planned protocols. But experience, courage, and the absolute refusal to quit, those qualities never become obsolete." That evening, Grace returned to her cabin in the mountains. Her medical kit still sat by the door, but now it was accompanied by letters from students, invitations to speak at medical conferences, and requests from rescue teams around the world who wanted to learn her techniques. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat in her rocking chair, watching the sunset paint the peaks where she'd once been dismissed as too old and outdated to help. The mountains hadn't changed, but everything else had. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "New rescue tomorrow. Mountain climbing accident. Would you be available as primary medical advisor?" Grace smiled and typed back, "On my way." She'd learned something Captain Stevens never understood. Heroes don't retire. They just wait for the next person who needs saving. And in a world full of sophisticated equipment and modern protocols, sometimes the most important qualification is simply refusing to let someone die alone in the cold when you have the knowledge and courage to help. Grace Hammond walked to her medical kit, checking its contents with the same methodical precision she'd used for 40 years. Tomorrow there would be another mountain, another emergency, another chance to prove that some things never go out of style, experience, courage, the absolute refusal to quit. At 67 years old, Grace Hammond was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.